I learned very early in life that love in my family was something you had to earn, but somehow, no matter what I did, I was never able to earn enough of it. My younger sister Alina never seemed to have that problem. She didn't need to try, she didn't need to behave. Love came to her naturally, freely, like air filling a room. I watched it happen every day, as if I were standing outside a window, looking in at a life that should have been mine too. Alina was 3 years younger than me, but she was always treated as if she were fragile, special, and irreplaceable. When she was born, relatives visited our house with gifts and laughter, filling every corner with excitement. My mother kept telling everyone how beautiful her baby girl was, how she had brought light into their lives. I was 5 at the time, standing quietly in the doorway of the bedroom, holding the drawing I had made for my mother. No one noticed me there, and after a while, I quietly folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. As we grew older, the differences became impossible to ignore. Alina's birthdays were grand celebrations that started weeks in advance. My parents would discuss themes, cakes, guest lists, and decorations like they were planning a royal event. There would be colorful balloons tied to every chair, fairy lights hanging across the walls, and a cake so large it took up half the table. On the day of her party, she would wear a new dress, and my parents would hover around her, making sure she was happy every second. My birthdays were different. They were never forgotten, but they were never important either. I would get a simple cake from the local bakery, a quiet dinner with just the 4 of us, and a quick hug before everyone returned to their usual routine. My parents always said they would do something bigger next year, but next year always came and went without anything changing. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was older and more mature, but the truth was I would lie awake at night, replaying Alina's parties in my head, wondering what it felt like to be celebrated like that. At school, I worked hard because it felt like the only thing I could control. I stayed up late studying, even when I was tired, because I believed that if I brought home perfect grades, my parents would finally look at me the way they looked at Alina. When I came first in my class for the first time, I ran all the way home, my report card clutched tightly in my hand. I burst through the front door, breathless and smiling, expecting excitement, maybe even pride. My mother glanced at the report card while stirring something on the stove. She nodded and said, "That's good," before turning back to the pot. Then she asked me to help Alina with her homework because she was struggling again. I remember standing there, the paper trembling slightly in my hand, waiting for something more, some sign that my achievement meant something. It never came. Helping Alina with her homework became part of my routine. She would sit beside me, swinging her legs, complaining about how boring the work was. If she didn't understand something, she would get frustrated and push her notebook away. If I tried to explain patiently, she would accuse me of acting like a teacher. If she failed a test, my parents would ask me why I hadn't helped her enough. Whenever something went wrong in the house, I was the first one they looked at. If a glass broke, they assumed I had knocked it over. If Alina cried, they believed I had said something to upset her. She learned quickly that tears were her strongest weapon. A few well-timed sobs, and the attention shifted to her, leaving me to explain myself to parents who had already decided I was guilty. I started to notice the way relatives treated us differently too. At family gatherings, Alina was always pulled into hugs, asked about her hobbies, praised for the smallest things. I would sit quietly beside the adults, listening to conversations I wasn't part of. Sometimes someone would turn to me and say, "You're the older one, right? You must be very responsible." It wasn't said like a compliment. It was more like a reminder of the role I was expected to play. As we grew into our teenage years, the gap between us widened. Alina was allowed to go out with friends, stay out late, and spend money on things she didn't need. When I asked for the same freedom, my parents said I had to set an example. I was told to focus on my studies, to be careful, to think about the family's reputation. It felt like I was living under a set of rules that didn't apply to anyone else. There were nights when I would lie in bed and try to figure out what I had done wrong. I replayed moments from my childhood, searching for a mistake big enough to explain why I was treated differently. Maybe I had been a difficult child. Maybe I had cried too much or asked for too much attention. I wondered if love was something I had somehow used up without realizing it. One evening, when I was about 15, I overheard my parents talking in the living room. They thought I was asleep, but their voices carried down the hallway. My mother was worried about Alina's grades and how she was falling behind in school. My father said not to worry, that Alina had a soft heart and that people like her always found their way because others wanted to help them. Then he mentioned me. He said I was strong and independent, that I didn't need as much attention because I could take care of myself. At first, I felt a strange sense of pride hearing him describe me that way. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, the meaning behind his words slowly sank in. They didn't give me less because they thought I deserved less. They gave me less because they believed I would survive without it. That realization changed something inside me. I stopped expecting praise. I stopped sharing my achievements unless they were directly asked about. I became quieter, more careful with my emotions, because I understood that there was no point in showing them to people who didn't know what to do with them. By the time I turned 18, I had perfected the art of being invisible in my own home. I did my chores, kept my grades high, helped Alina whenever she needed it, and avoided creating any problems. On the surface, I was the perfect daughter, obedient, hardworking, and dependable. But inside, I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, someone tolerated rather than cherished. I still loved my parents. That was the hardest part. No matter how many times they overlooked me or chose Alina over me, a part of me kept hoping that one day they would look at me and realize what they had missed. I imagined a moment when they would apologize, when they would tell me they were proud of me, when they would treat me not as a backup plan, but as someone who mattered just as much. That moment never came. Instead, I carried those silent disappointments with me, stacking them one on top of the other like fragile glass, until I was living inside a house built from everything I had never said. By the time I finished school, I had learned not to expect anything from my parents, but I still carried a quiet hope that things might eventually change. I had worked hard through my final years, not only because I wanted good grades, but because I needed a way out. I spent my evenings tutoring younger students in the neighborhood, designing simple posters and social media graphics for local businesses, and saving every bit of money I earned. It wasn't much at first, but over time, it grew into something meaningful. That money represented freedom to me, a chance to build a life where I wasn't constantly compared, blamed, or ignored. I kept my savings a secret. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew that if my parents knew how much I had, they would find a reason to use it. I opened a small bank account in my own name and carefully tracked every deposit in a notebook I kept hidden under my mattress. Each time I added a new amount, I felt a small spark of hope. I imagined moving into a small apartment near my future university, decorating it the way I wanted, and waking up in a place where no one expected me to be second best. Around that time, Alina started talking constantly about studying abroad. She had always loved the idea of traveling and living in another country, but her grades were far from good enough to earn a scholarship. She spoke about foreign universities, as if getting into one was simply a matter of choosing where she wanted to go. My parents encouraged her, telling her she deserved to see the world, that she was too special to stay in one place. At first, I stayed out of those conversations. I focused on my own plans, researching local universities and affordable programs I could realistically attend. I knew our family didn't have enough money to send anyone overseas without financial aid, so I assumed the topic would fade away once reality set in. But instead, the conversations became more serious. My parents started meeting with education consultants and discussing tuition fees, accommodation costs, and visa requirements late into the night. One evening, my mother knocked softly on my bedroom door. She rarely did that, and the small gesture immediately made me nervous. She sat down on the edge of my bed and smiled at me in a way that felt unfamiliar. She began by asking about my studies and telling me how proud she was that I had always been so responsible. The words sounded sweet, but there was something rehearsed about them, as if she had practiced this conversation in her head before coming to me. After a few minutes, she mentioned Alina's dream of studying abroad and how important this opportunity was for her future. She explained that the costs were much higher than they had expected and that the family's savings were not enough to cover everything. Then she paused and looked directly at me, her expression soft but expectant. She said that families needed to support each other, and that sometimes the older sibling had to make sacrifices so the younger one could succeed. I didn't say anything at first. My mind was racing, connecting the dots faster than I wanted it to. I knew exactly where this conversation was heading, but a part of me still hoped I was wrong. Then she finally asked if I would be willing to contribute my savings to help Alina achieve her dream. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. I stared at my hands, feeling my chest tighten. That money was everything I had worked for over the past 3 years. It was my safety net, my escape plan, my proof that I could build something on my own. Hearing her ask for it so casually felt like someone had reached inside me and grabbed something deeply personal. I tried to explain that I had been saving for my own education and that I needed that money to support myself. My mother's expression changed slightly, the softness replaced by disappointment. She said that I was strong and capable, that I would find another way, but Alina needed this chance now, or she might never get another one. Later that night, my father joined the conversation. He spoke in a firmer tone, saying that as the older daughter, it was my duty to think about the family's future, not just my own. He reminded me of everything they had provided for me growing up and said that this was my opportunity to give back. The word selfish was used more than once, each time landing like a slap. Alina didn't approach me privately to thank me or even to ask how I felt about it. Instead, she talked about her plans openly at the dinner table, discussing which country she preferred, what kind of apartment she wanted, and how exciting it would be to live independently. She acted as if my contribution was already guaranteed, as if my savings were just another family resource she had the right to use. I spent several sleepless nights going back and forth in my mind. One part of me was furious. I knew it was unfair. I knew they would never have asked Alina to give up her dreams for mine. But another part of me still craved their approval. I kept imagining that if I agreed, they would finally see me as more than just the quiet, dependable daughter in the background. Maybe they would appreciate my sacrifice. Maybe things would change. In the end, that hope won. The day I withdrew the money from my account, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely sign the form. I watched the teller count the cash and slide it across the counter, and it felt like I was handing over pieces of my future one by one. When I gave the envelope to my parents that evening, my mother hugged me tightly and said she knew she could always count on me. My father nodded with approval, calling me their good daughter. For a brief moment, warmth spread through my chest. It wasn't the kind of love I had always wanted, but it was something. I held on to that feeling, telling myself that this sacrifice would finally bring us closer together. In the weeks that followed, the house was filled with excitement about Alina's departure. New clothes were bought, suitcases were packed, and relatives were invited over to congratulate her. Whenever someone praised her for getting the chance to study abroad, my parents would mention that the family had come together to make it happen, but they never said my name directly. I was simply included in the word family, my individual contribution quietly absorbed into the background. On the day she left, we all went to the airport to see her off. Alina cried dramatically while hugging our parents, promising to call every day and make them proud. When she turned to me, she gave me a quick hug and said, "Thanks, I guess. I'll make it worth it." Her words were casual, almost distracted, as if she were thanking someone for holding a door open rather than giving up their entire savings. As I watched her walk toward the departure gate, surrounded by excitement and attention, a strange emptiness settled inside me. I had imagined that this moment would feel meaningful, that there would be some sense of shared pride or emotional closure. Instead, I just felt tired. When we returned home, my parents spent the evening talking about how quiet the house felt without Alina and how much they already missed her. I sat with them for a while, listening, waiting to see if anyone would ask how I was feeling after everything. No one did. That night, I went to my room and opened the notebook where I had carefully recorded every rupee I had saved. The last entry stared back at me like a ghost of the life I had planned. I closed the notebook and slid it back under the mattress, even though it was empty now. It felt wrong to throw it away. It was the only proof that, for a while, I had been working towards something that was entirely mine. I told myself I had done the right thing, that this was what good daughters did. But as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered a question I couldn't ignore. If they truly loved me, why did it always have to be me who gave things up to prove it? When Alina first left for university abroad, the house felt quieter, but not in the peaceful way I had imagined. It was a heavy kind of quiet, filled with my parents' constant worry about her and their endless conversations about how she was adjusting to her new life. They called her every evening, asking if she had eaten, if she was safe, if she needed more money. I would sit nearby sometimes, pretending to read, listening to the way their voices softened when they spoke to her, full of affection and concern that I had rarely heard directed at me. For the first few weeks, Alina called regularly, excitedly describing her new apartment, her classmates, and the freedom she felt being in a different country. My parents listened to her like she was narrating an adventure movie, laughing at her stories and praising her bravery. I tried to be happy for her, reminding myself that I had made this possible. Whenever she spoke to me directly, it was usually to complain about small inconveniences, how expensive groceries were or how hard it was to wake up for morning lectures. As months passed, her calls became less frequent. She started sending more photos than messages, pictures of parties, restaurants, and weekend trips. Her social media was filled with smiling selfies and captions about living her dream life. My parents, however, chose to believe that everything was going perfectly. Whenever I pointed out that she seemed to be spending more time socializing than studying, they dismissed my concerns and accused me of being jealous. One evening, my father received an email from the university requesting a meeting regarding Alina's academic performance. I happened to be in the room when he read it, and I saw his expression shift from confusion to worry. That night, they called Alina and asked her directly about her grades. She laughed it off at first, saying the university was exaggerating and that she just needed time to adjust. My parents accepted her explanation without much resistance, telling her not to stress and assuring her that they believed in her. But the emails didn't stop. They became more serious, mentioning missed classes, failed assignments, and warnings about possible disciplinary action if her performance didn't improve. Each time, Alina had a new excuse. The professors were unfair. The course material was too difficult. She was feeling homesick. My parents defended her every time, saying she had always been sensitive and needed emotional support, not criticism. A year later, the truth could no longer be ignored. Alina was officially placed on academic probation. I still remember the day my parents received the formal letter. My mother cried as if someone had died, while my father paced the living room in silence. I felt a strange mix of sadness and frustration. I didn't want her to fail, but a part of me also felt angry that the money I had sacrificed so much for was being wasted. They asked me what they should do, as if I were suddenly part of the decision-making process. I suggested that they should talk to Alina honestly and make it clear that she needed to take responsibility for her studies. Instead, they sent her more money, telling her to focus on her mental health and not worry about finances. By the end of the second year, the inevitable happened. Alina was expelled for failing too many courses. She called home in tears, saying she had tried her best and that the system had been against her from the beginning. My parents immediately shifted into comfort mode, telling her that her well-being was more important than any degree and that she could always come back home. When she returned, there were no harsh words, no consequences, no serious conversations about accountability. My mother cooked her favorite dishes for days, and my father took time off work to spend time with her. Relatives who visited expressed sympathy, saying that studying abroad was difficult, and that not everyone was suited for it. No one mentioned the years of savings that had disappeared or the opportunities that had been lost. A week after she came back, life in the house returned to its old pattern, except this time the tension felt thicker. Alina spent most of her days sleeping late, scrolling through her phone, or watching television. Whenever my parents tried to gently suggest that she should start thinking about her next steps, she would become defensive or emotional, and the conversation would end with them apologizing for pressuring her. One evening, after dinner, my parents asked me to stay in the living room while Alina went to her room. I sensed what was coming even before they spoke. My father cleared his throat and said that Alina was feeling lost and needed a new direction. My mother added that starting a small business might give her confidence and help her rebuild her future. Then they told me that they needed my help again. This time, they didn't ask for savings because I didn't have any left. Instead, they wanted me to take out a bank loan in my name so Alina could use the money to start an online boutique she had been talking about. They explained that her credit history was non-existent and that the bank would be more willing to approve a loan for me because I had a stable part-time job and a clean record. I stared at them, waiting for them to realize how unreasonable this sounded. I waited for one of them to laugh and say they were joking, but their expressions remained serious, full of expectation. They spoke as if this was a normal request, just another family sacrifice I should be willing to make without hesitation. For the first time in my life, I felt something stronger than disappointment. I felt anger, hot, sharp, and impossible to ignore. I reminded them that I had already given up my savings for Alina's education and that I was still trying to build my own future from scratch. I said that taking on a loan would put me in debt for years, especially if the business failed. My father's face hardened. He said that I was being dramatic and that family members were supposed to support each other during difficult times. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she accused me of abandoning my sister when she needed me the most. They spoke as if my refusal would be the reason Alina's life fell apart, not her own choices. Alina, who had been listening from the hallway, walked into the room at that point. She crossed her arms and looked at me with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. She said she couldn't believe I was being so selfish after everything the family had done for me. Her words felt like a punch to the chest. I wanted to ask her what exactly they had done for me, but the words got stuck in my throat. The argument escalated quickly. Voices were raised, accusations were thrown, and for the first time, I didn't back down. I repeated that I would not take out a loan and that I had the right to think about my own future. My father slammed his hand on the table, calling me ungrateful and disrespectful. My mother cried openly, saying she had failed as a parent because her daughters were turning against each other. That night, the house felt colder than it ever had before. No one spoke to me during dinner, and I could hear my parents comforting Alina in her room, telling her not to worry and assuring her that they would find another solution. I sat alone in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at the dark window and seeing my own reflection looking back at me. It was in that moment that I realized something I had been avoiding for years. No matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. There would always be another sacrifice expected, another way for me to prove my love and loyalty, while Alina would continue to receive unconditional support without ever being asked to prove hers. Around midnight, I went to my room and pulled out a small suitcase from the back of my closet. My hands were steady this time, not shaking like they had when I withdrew my savings years ago. I folded my clothes carefully, packed my documents, and placed the little notebook of old savings records at the bottom of the bag. Each item I packed felt like a step toward something unknown, but necessary. Before leaving, I stood in the doorway of my room and looked around one last time. The walls were covered with certificates, old photographs, and reminders of a life I had tried so hard to make meaningful within the limits I had been given. I didn't feel sadness as much as I felt a strange sense of clarity. I walked out of the house quietly, closing the front door behind me without making a sound. There was no dramatic goodbye, no tearful confrontation, just the soft click of the lock and the realization that for the first time in my life, I was no longer waiting for someone else to choose me. The first night on my own was nothing like the freedom I had imagined during all those years of planning my escape. I rented a small room in a shared apartment on the edge of the city, a place with cracked walls, a flickering tube light, and a mattress so thin I could feel the wooden boards beneath it. I sat on the edge of that bed with my suitcase still closed beside me, listening to unfamiliar voices coming from the other rooms and wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. The silence I had longed for in my parents' house felt different here. Back there, the silence had been filled with tension and unspoken expectations. Here, it was empty and indifferent. No one asked where I had been or what I was doing. No one reminded me to be careful or to think of the family. It was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The next morning, reality set in quickly. I had limited money, no permanent job, and only a vague plan of continuing my studies while working enough to survive. I spent hours walking from one office to another, handing out printed copies of my resume and asking about part-time positions. Some places rejected me immediately. Others told me they would call but never did. Each rejection stung, but it also strengthened my resolve. Going back home was not an option. After 2 weeks of searching, I finally secured a position at a small printing shop as a junior assistant. The pay was low, and the hours were long, but it was enough to cover my share of rent and basic expenses. In the evenings, I attended classes at a local college, determined to complete my degree even if it took longer than expected. My days became a cycle of work, study, and exhaustion, leaving little time to dwell on the emotional weight of what I had left behind. There were nights when I would collapse onto my bed, without even changing clothes, my body aching and my mind buzzing with unfinished assignments. Sometimes I cried quietly into my pillow, not because I regretted leaving, but because the loneliness felt overwhelming. I had spent my whole life in a house full of people, even if I had never truly felt seen there. Now, I was alone in every sense of the word. Slowly, though, small moments of comfort began to appear. One of my roommates, a nursing student named Sana, started leaving an extra cup of tea on the kitchen table for me when she noticed how late I returned from work. At the printing shop, my supervisor began trusting me with more complex design tasks after seeing how quickly I learned. For the first time, people were acknowledging my effort without comparing me to anyone else. As months passed, I became more confident in my abilities. I started taking freelance graphic design projects online again, the same kind of work I had once done secretly, while saving money for my future. This time, however, the earnings were entirely mine to keep and use as I saw fit. I saved a portion of every payment, not out of fear that someone would take it, but because I finally had a goal that belonged only to me. The first big milestone came when I was able to move out of the shared apartment and into a small studio of my own. It wasn't luxurious by any means, just a single room with a kitchenette and a narrow balcony, but to me it felt like a palace. I remember standing in the empty space on the day I received the keys, running my fingers along the freshly painted walls, and realizing that every inch of that room had been earned through my own effort. I decorated the apartment slowly, buying secondhand furniture and inexpensive decorations from local markets. Each item had a story behind it, a reminder of a project completed or a paycheck saved. Unlike my childhood home, where I had always felt like a temporary guest, this space reflected my choices and my taste. It was the first place where I felt truly at home. Finishing my degree took longer than it would have if I had stayed in a more stable environment. But when I finally walked across the stage to receive my certificate, the sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. There were no parents in the audience, no proud family members taking photos, but I didn't feel the emptiness I once would have. I had learned to validate my own achievements, to celebrate my own milestones without waiting for someone else's approval. With my degree in hand and a growing portfolio of freelance work, I decided to take a risk and start applying for full-time positions in design agencies. The interviews were nerve-wracking, but I carried myself with a confidence that had been forged through years of handling rejection and disappointment. When I finally received an offer from a mid-sized marketing firm, I read the email 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. My first day at the firm felt surreal. I was given my own desk, introduced to a team of creative professionals, and assigned projects that challenged me in ways I had never experienced before. The salary was more than I had ever earned, and for the first time, I could think about more than just surviving month to month. I began saving seriously again, building a financial cushion that made me feel secure in a way I had never felt growing up. Over time, my work started gaining recognition within the company. Clients complimented my designs, and my manager often praised my reliability and attention to detail during team meetings. Each compliment felt like a small piece of the validation I had spent my childhood craving. The difference was that now, I didn't depend on it to feel worthy. It was simply an acknowledgement of the effort I had already learned to value in myself. I also built a circle of friends who knew me for who I was in the present, not who I had been forced to be in the past. We spent weekends exploring the city, trying new restaurants, or simply sitting in my tiny apartment watching movies and laughing about work stress. With them, I didn't have to play the role of the responsible older sister or the invisible daughter. I was just another young woman figuring out her life, and that normalcy felt extraordinary. Years passed without any contact from my family. At first, I checked my old email and social media accounts regularly, half expecting a message asking if I was okay or telling me they missed me. When nothing came, I felt a familiar sting of rejection, but this time it didn't define me. Eventually, I stopped checking altogether. The absence of their voices in my life became my new normal, and with that absence came a peace I had never experienced before. My career continued to grow. After a few years at the marketing firm, I was promoted to a senior designer position, leading small teams on major projects. The confidence I had gained from building my life independently made it easier to take on leadership roles and voice my ideas without fear. Clients began requesting me by name, and my portfolio expanded with campaigns that reached audiences far beyond anything I had imagined when I was designing posters in my childhood bedroom. Looking back, I realized that the girl who had left her parents' house with a single suitcase would not have recognized the woman I had become. I had learned to manage my finances, negotiate contracts, handle workplace conflicts, and trust my own judgment. Every skill I developed was a direct result of being forced to rely on myself when no one else was willing to support me. Despite all this growth, there were still moments when memories of my family surfaced unexpectedly. Sometimes it happened when I saw a mother helping her daughter choose clothes in a store, or when colleagues spoke about visiting their parents over holidays. A brief ache would settle in my chest, a reminder of what I had lost or perhaps never truly had. But those moments were fleeting. They no longer had the power to pull me back into the cycle of longing and disappointment that had defined my youth. Instead, I began to see my past as something that had shaped me rather than something that continued to control me. The neglect, the unfairness, the constant comparisons, they had all forced me to develop resilience, independence, and a strong sense of self-worth. It wasn't the path I would have chosen, but it was the path that had led me to a life where I finally felt in control of my own destiny. By the time nearly 8 years had passed since I walked out of my parents' house, I had built a life that was stable, fulfilling, and entirely my own. I had a comfortable apartment, a respected position at work, a growing savings account, and friendships that felt genuine and supportive. I no longer measured my value based on whether my parents acknowledged me or not. I had become the person I once needed, someone who believed in me, protected me, and refused to let my worth be decided by others. The message came on an ordinary Tuesday evening, just as I was finishing a project that had kept me at my desk long after everyone else had left the office. I was about to shut down my computer when my phone vibrated with a notification from an unknown number. Normally, I ignored messages from numbers I didn't recognize, but something about the timing made me pause. I opened it, expecting a wrong number or a promotional message. Instead, I saw a name I hadn't read in nearly 8 years. It was my mother. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Her message was short and careful, written in a tone that felt both familiar and distant. She wrote that she hoped I was doing well, and that she had tried to reach me several times through my old contacts without success. Then she explained that my father had fallen ill and that things had been difficult at home. She said they were struggling, both emotionally and financially, and that they missed me. She ended the message by asking if I could come back, even just for a visit, because the family needed to be together during such a hard time. My first reaction wasn't anger or sadness. It was disbelief. After all those years of silence, after never once checking if I was safe or alive, the first message they sent was not an apology or an acknowledgement of the past. It was a request. It felt like no time had passed at all, as if I were still the daughter expected to step in whenever things became inconvenient for everyone else. I set the phone down on my desk and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Memories I had carefully packed away began to surface: the airport goodbye, the empty notebook of savings, the slammed door the night I left. I had spent years building a life where those memories no longer dictated my choices. Yet here they were again, knocking on the door I had worked so hard to close. When I got home that night, I reread the message several times. Each time, I searched for words that might suggest regret or self-awareness. There were none. She spoke about my father's illness in detail, about medical bills and how stressful everything had become. She mentioned that Alina's business had failed, and that she was now living back at home without a stable income. The message was filled with updates about their struggles, but it contained no acknowledgement of the way they had treated me before I left. I found myself wondering how they had explained my absence to relatives and neighbors over the years. Had they told people I had gone away for work and simply lost touch? Or had they painted me as the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her family? The thought stung more than I expected, even though I knew it shouldn't matter anymore. For the next few days, I carried the weight of that message with me everywhere. At work, I caught myself staring blankly at my screen, replaying different versions of possible responses in my mind. Some were filled with anger, listing every sacrifice I had made and every moment they had overlooked me. Others were softer, asking why they had never reached out before and whether they truly missed me or just needed my help again. One evening, I mentioned the situation to Sana, who had remained one of my closest friends over the years. We were sitting on my balcony, drinking tea as the city lights flickered on one by one. She listened quietly as I explained the message and the history behind it. When I finished, she didn't immediately tell me what to do. Instead, she asked me a simple question: if they had messaged me years earlier, before I had built this life, how would I have reacted? The answer came to me instantly. Back then, I would have rushed home without hesitation, desperate for any sign that they cared. I would have dropped everything, convinced that this was my chance to finally be accepted. Realizing that made something clear in a way nothing else had. The person they were reaching out to now was not the same girl who had left their house with a suitcase and a broken heart. That night, I drafted several replies, but deleted each one before sending it. I didn't want my response to be driven by old wounds or by a need to prove something. I wanted it to come from the person I had become, someone who knew her worth and understood that love without respect was not love at all. A week after receiving the message, I finally typed out a response. I kept it short, not because I didn't have more to say, but because I had spent too many years explaining myself to people who had never truly listened. I wrote that I was sorry to hear about my father's illness, and that I hoped he received the care he needed. Then I added a single line that carried the weight of everything I had experienced growing up. I hope Alina is there for you. You always said she was the one you needed. I read the message twice before sending it. My finger hovered over the send button for a moment, and I felt a brief flutter of nerves, like I was about to step onto a stage in front of a silent audience. Then I pressed it, set the phone down, and exhaled slowly. Her reply came less than an hour later. She wrote that she didn't understand why I was being so cold, and that families should stand together in difficult times. She said that holding on to past grudges would only hurt me in the long run. There was still no apology, no recognition of the years I had spent feeling invisible in my own home. Reading her response didn't make me angry. Instead, it confirmed what I had already suspected, that they still saw me not as an individual with my own boundaries and feelings, but as a resource they could turn to whenever necessary. I didn't respond again. Instead, I blocked the number and deleted the conversation, not out of spite, but as a final step in protecting the peace I had built. In the days that followed, I expected to feel guilt or second-guess my decision. After all, society constantly emphasized the importance of family loyalty and forgiveness. But what I felt instead was a quiet sense of relief. The chapter I had closed years ago had briefly reopened, and I had faced it without falling back into old patterns. Occasionally, I wondered how things were going for them. I imagined my father recovering slowly or perhaps growing weaker, my mother managing the household alone, and Alina struggling to find her direction again. Those thoughts carried a hint of sadness, but they no longer felt like my responsibility. They had made their choices repeatedly, choosing to invest all their attention and resources into one child while expecting the other to simply adapt. One afternoon, as I was organizing old files on my computer, I came across a scanned copy of the notebook where I had once recorded my savings. Seeing the careful handwriting and the small amounts I had been so proud of back then made me smile in a bittersweet way. That girl had believed that sacrificing everything would earn her love. The woman I had become understood that love demanded freely and taken for granted was never truly love in the first place. Years later, when people asked me about my family, I kept my answers simple. I would say that we weren't in touch and changed the subject. I didn't feel the need to share the details or justify my choices. My life was full of people who treated me with kindness and respect, people who valued me not for what I could give them but for who I was. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit on my balcony and look out at the city lights, thinking about the long path that had brought me here. I had started as the overlooked daughter in a house where I felt invisible, someone who believed her worth was measured by how much she could sacrifice for others. Now, I was a woman who had built a stable career, a peaceful home, and a strong sense of self without relying on the approval of those who had once held power over her. Choosing not to return to my family had not been an act of revenge. It had been an act of self-preservation. I had simply allowed them to live with the reality of the choices they had made for years, choices that had pushed one daughter away while lifting the other onto a pedestal she could not sustain. In the end, I didn't feel like I had lost a family. I felt like I had finally gained a life.